Hi guys. The evening Megan told me she was pregnant should have been one of the happiest moments of my life. Instead, it felt like the ground had been pulled from under me. She came home that Thursday with a glow in her eyes and a nervous energy I couldn't quite place. I was seated at the kitchen table, working on my laptop, when she dropped the news. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice trembling slightly, a smile on her lips. For a moment I was stunned. My first instinct was joy, a baby. But then the dates swirled in my mind. Megan had returned from her work trip just 3 weeks ago. If she was pregnant now, the math didn't make sense. My smile froze, but I quickly forced myself to hide the confusion. I hugged her, told her how happy I was, and tried to ignore the knot forming in my chest. Later that night, as Megan slept beside me, I lay awake, replaying everything in my head. The trip to Chicago, 5 days at a marketing conference. She had come back exhausted but cheerful. Now this. My thoughts circled back to those 2 weeks before her trip when she had seemed distracted, always glued to her phone, smiling at texts she never shared. Back then, I thought it was work stress or silly memes with friends. Now, those moments seemed suspicious. The next day, while Megan went to yoga, I decided to use her laptop under the pretense of needing it for my work. I wasn't proud of myself, but I needed answers. I started with her emails, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. Most of it was work-related. Then I found her browser history, recent searches for photos of the hotel where the conference had been held. My heart thudded. Why would she be looking up the hotel after she'd already been there? I moved to her text messages. Most of the threads were innocuous, until I found one with someone named Nate. The messages weren't romantic, at least not overtly, but there was a casualness in the way they spoke that felt too familiar. My gut twisted. Nate was someone she hadn't mentioned before, and that alone raised alarm bells. That evening, I couldn't hold back. After dinner, I turned to her. "Hey, can I ask you something? About your trip to Chicago?" She looked at me, her smile faltering slightly. "What about it? Emily mentioned you spent a lot of time with someone named Nate," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. Megan's face tightened, and I saw a flicker of something. Fear? Panic? "Oh, Nate," she said quickly. "He's just a colleague. We were discussing a potential partnership." "Why are you asking?" "The timing of the pregnancy," I said carefully. "It's been bothering me. You've been back for 3 weeks, but you said you're 6 weeks pregnant. That doesn't add up." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. Then she sighed, crossing her arms defensively. "Alex, nothing happened with Nate. He's married, for God's sake. And we didn't even spend that much time together. The pregnancy, maybe I miscalculated. These things aren't exact, you know." But her explanation didn't sit right. The timelines, her body language, it all felt off. I wanted to believe her, but the seed of doubt had already been planted, and it was growing fast. Over the next few days, I found myself noticing more inconsistencies. Megan was unusually jumpy, avoiding eye contact whenever I mentioned the baby. She became overly affectionate, almost as if trying to compensate for something. One evening, as we were watching TV, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and quickly flipped it over. My stomach churned. "Who was that?" I asked casually. "Just work stuff," she replied too quickly. I nodded, but my mind was racing. I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I called Emily again. "Hey, Emily," I started, trying to sound casual. "Do you remember if Megan and Nate spent a lot of time together during the conference?" Emily hesitated. "Well, they did have dinner a few times," she admitted. "But, Alex, I'm sure it was all professional." Megan seemed pretty focused on work. Her words didn't reassure me. If anything, they only added to my unease. That night, I confronted Megan again. This time, I didn't mince words. "Are you sure this baby is mine?" Megan stared at me, her face pale as a sheet. "How can you even ask me that?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Of course it's yours, Alex." But the doubt in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't sure. Maybe she was telling herself a story, hoping it was true, but the timelines didn't lie. My heart broke as I realized the woman I had trusted most in the world might be hiding something so devastating. I wanted to believe her, but the gnawing doubt wouldn't let me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Megan's reassurances about the pregnancy rang hollow, her behavior continued to be off, and the name Nate kept bouncing around in my head like an alarm bell I couldn't silence. But my suspicions truly spiraled the morning I decided to take another look at her laptop. She had left it on the kitchen counter before heading out for brunch with a friend. The temptation was too strong. I knew it was wrong, but the doubt had turned into a gnawing ache, and I needed to know the truth. As I opened her laptop, my hands were shaking. My first stop was her emails again, hoping to find something concrete. Most of it was still work-related, but then I found an archive folder I hadn't noticed before. Hidden among mundane work messages was a thread titled Project Recap, and attached to it were photos of Megan at a hotel bar, laughing and leaning in close to a man I didn't recognize. The timestamp on the email was from 6 months ago, around the time she had gone on another work trip. My stomach turned. The man wasn't Nate. It was someone named Nick. I opened another email from the same folder. The subject line was generic, follow-up. Inside, I found what seemed to be a mundane exchange about a conference session until I scrolled down to see Megan's response. It was casual, but there was something in the tone that felt too personal. Looking forward to our next late-night brainstorm, she had written. I sat back in the chair, staring at the screen. Late-night brainstorm? I scrolled further down the thread and found nothing else, but the tone of that one line was enough to make my blood run cold. It wasn't proof, but it was close. I went to her photo folder next. She was meticulous about keeping her photos organized, but I noticed a locked album labeled Work Stuff. The password wasn't hard to guess. She used the name of our dog for almost everything. My heart raced as the folder opened. Inside were photos of her and Nick at various conferences and work dinners. In some, they were posed with other colleagues, but there were others, just the two of them, where the intimacy was undeniable. In one, they were sitting together on a couch, her head tilted toward him as he looked at her with an unmistakable softness. In another, they were laughing over drinks, their bodies angled close. My hands tightened into fists as I stared at the screen. I closed the laptop abruptly, feeling sick. It wasn't just the photos, it was the realization that this wasn't some fleeting mistake. This was something more, something longer, deeper. When Megan came home that afternoon, I could barely look at her. She breezed in, all smiles, carrying a bag of leftovers from the cafe she had gone to. She kissed me on the cheek and set the bag on the counter. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, tilting her head. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." It was a lie, but I needed time to think. I couldn't confront her yet, not without more proof. Over the next few days, I kept my distance while quietly piecing things together. I managed to find Nick's number in her contacts and decided to check our phone bill for their call logs. My stomach dropped when I saw the frequency of their calls. Some were short, just a few minutes, but others were over an hour, often late at night when I thought she was asleep. The final nail came 2 nights later when Megan left her phone charging on the kitchen counter while she showered. My hands shook as I picked it up, scrolling quickly through her messages. Most had been deleted, but there was a backup folder in her chat app that she must have forgotten about. There they were. Messages from Nick. One read, "I miss you already. Can't wait for next month." Another, "Last night was perfect. I wish I could hold you forever." But the one that broke me was a photo he had sent her, a selfie of the two of them in bed. Her hair was messy, her face flushed, and his arm was draped around her. The timestamp was from the night she had told me she was working late at the office. My vision blurred with anger and betrayal as I set the phone down. This was it. There was no doubt anymore. My wife, the woman I had trusted, loved, and built a life with, had been having an affair. That night, as Megan sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I confronted her. "Who is Nick?" I asked, my voice calm but cold. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. "What?" "You heard me," I said, standing over her. "Who is Nick? The guy you've been messaging, the guy you've been seeing behind my back?" Her face drained of color. "Alex, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Megan." I shouted, my voice breaking. I've seen the messages. The photos. I know everything. She froze, her mouth opening and closing like she was struggling to find words. Alex, how long has this been going on? I demanded. Tears welled up in her eyes and she shook her head. It's not what you think. Don't you dare tell me that, I snapped. You've been cheating on me, Megan. How long? 2 years, she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. 2 years. The weight of it crushed me. For 2 years, she had been lying to me, sneaking around, building a life with someone else while pretending to be my wife. Why? I asked, my voice breaking. Why would you do this to me? She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I don't know. It just happened. We started talking more at work, and I felt connected to him in a way I hadn't felt with you in so long. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Her words felt like knives. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to hurt her the way she had hurt me. But all I could do was stand there, the life I thought I had crumbling around me. I left the room without another word, slamming the door behind me. The silence in the house after that confrontation was suffocating. Megan had retreated to the bedroom, and I stayed on the couch, staring blankly at the dark TV screen. Her admission, 2 years of betrayal, kept looping in my mind. The anger, the hurt, the humiliation, it all churned inside me like a storm I couldn't control. And yet, one thought stood out above the others. The baby. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The timing, the affair, everything pointed to one horrifying possibility, that the child Megan was carrying wasn't mine. I had to know. The next morning, I didn't bother speaking to Megan. She barely looked at me as she sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee with trembling hands. I grabbed my keys and walked out without a word, heading to work as if my world wasn't falling apart. At lunchtime, I made a stop at a local clinic and asked about paternity testing. The nurse explained the process, how they could do a non-invasive prenatal test using a simple blood sample from Megan and me. It was quick, accurate, and would give me the answer I desperately needed. But I had to convince Megan to agree to it. That night, I brought it up. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes red and puffy from crying. We need to do a paternity test, I said, my voice flat. Her head snapped up. What? You heard me, I said, crossing my arms. I don't trust you, Megan. Not after what you've done. I need to know if this baby is mine. Her lip quivered and she shook her head. Alex, it's yours. I swear it's yours. How can you expect me to believe that? I snapped, my voice rising. You've been sleeping with Nick for 2 years. For all I know, he's the father. It's not like that, she said desperately. We were careful, most of the time. Most of the time? I laughed bitterly. You want me to take that as proof? She didn't respond. Her silence was deafening, and it only fueled my anger. You owe me this, I said, my voice hard. If you're so sure the baby is mine, then prove it. Take the test. Her shoulders slumped in defeat, and she nodded. Okay, she whispered. The test itself was a quick, clinical affair. Megan sat in the chair at the clinic, staring at the floor while the nurse drew her blood. I went next, my mind racing as the needle pricked my arm. Megan didn't say a word the entire time, and I didn't have the energy to push her. The results would take a week. 7 days of unbearable waiting, 7 days of me avoiding Megan as much as possible. She tried a few times to talk to me, to explain herself, but I couldn't bear to hear it. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was betrayal. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at work when my phone buzzed, and I saw the number from the clinic. My heart pounded as I stepped into an empty conference room to take the call. Mr. Lawson, the nurse said, we have the results of your paternity test. I gripped the phone tighter. And? Her voice was calm, clinical as she delivered the blow. The results show that you are not the biological father of the child. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I leaned against the wall, struggling to breathe. Thank you, I managed to choke out before hanging up. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my head spinning. It was real. The baby wasn't mine. Megan had lied to me over and over again, and now there was no denying it. When I got home that evening, Megan was waiting for me in the living room. She stood as I walked in, her eyes searching mine for any clue of what I knew. The results came in, I said, my voice hollow. Her face crumbled. Alex. It's not mine, I said, cutting her off. The baby isn't mine, Megan. Tears streamed down her face as she stepped toward me. Alex, please, let me explain. Explain what? I shouted, the anger finally breaking free. That you lied to me? That you've been carrying Nick's child while pretending it was mine? Do you have any idea what you've done to me? I didn't know, she sobbed. I swear I didn't know. I hoped. I interrupted, my voice dripping with venom. You hoped what? That I'd never find out? That you could keep lying to me forever? I made a mistake, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You didn't mean for it to happen? I laughed bitterly. You had an affair for 2 years, Megan. That's not a mistake, that's a choice. A choice you made over and over again. She fell to her knees, her sobs racking her body. But I couldn't find it in myself to comfort her. The love I once felt for her had been shattered, replaced by a cold, hollow ache. I can't do this, I said, my voice breaking. I can't be here, pretending everything is okay. You've destroyed us, Megan. Alex, please, she begged. I love you. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this, I said, turning away. I walked out of the room, leaving her there, sobbing on the floor. I didn't know what came next, whether I would leave or she would. But one thing was clear, there was no coming back from this. The decision to file for divorce wasn't an easy one, but after everything Megan had done, there was no other choice. I couldn't look at her without feeling a wave of betrayal, and the thought of staying married to her made me feel sick. 4 days, I avoided talking to her directly, using the silence between us to process the next steps. I spent hours going over every aspect of our lives together, what we owned, our accounts, the house, everything. And, for the first time since the confrontation, I felt a glimmer of control when I remembered the prenuptial agreement. The prenup was something Megan and I had signed years ago, back when we were planning our wedding. At the time, Megan had been hesitant about it, calling it unnecessary and unromantic, but I'd insisted. My parents had drilled it into me early on that protecting my financial future was crucial, no matter how solid a relationship seemed. Now, that foresight was about to save me. I contacted a divorce attorney the following Monday, a no-nonsense woman named Linda. She listened as I explained everything, Megan's affair, the pregnancy, and how I had discovered the truth. When I mentioned the prenup, she nodded in approval. This is going to make things a lot easier for you, Linda said, her tone matter-of-fact. From what you've told me, she won't have much ground to stand on. We went over the details of the agreement together. It was airtight. Megan would have no claim to the house, which was in my name, and she wouldn't be entitled to any of my savings or investments. The only thing she'd keep was her personal belongings and her own income. Linda assured me that the court would side with me, especially given the circumstances. Infidelity and paternity fraud? The judge isn't going to have much sympathy for her, Linda said, tapping her pen against her notepad. I felt a flicker of relief hearing those words. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had solid ground to stand on. When I told Megan about the divorce, her reaction was exactly what I'd expected. Shock, followed by denial, and then anger. I waited until she was home from work one evening, sitting across from her in the living room with a folder of documents in my lap. I've filed for divorce, I said, keeping my tone steady. Her face went pale. Alex, no. We can fix this. Please, don't do this. There's nothing to fix, I said coldly. You destroyed this marriage the moment you decided to have an affair. And then you lied to me about the baby. I can't stay married to you, Megan. Tears filled her eyes, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the messages, the photos, the lies. I hardened myself against her tears. What about us? She pleaded. What about everything we've built together? I shook my head. You built a life with Nick, not me. You've left me no choice. When I handed her the divorce papers, her expression shifted to disbelief. A prenup, she said, her voice rising. You're going to use that against me? It's not using it against you, I said calmly. It's what we agreed to. You don't get to take the house or my savings after what you've done. She stared at me, anger flashing in her eyes. So what? You're just going to leave me with nothing? You'll keep your own income, I said. And the judge won't take kindly to your infidelity or the fact that you tried to pass another man's child off as mine. Be grateful this isn't worse. Her tears turned to anger, and she stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. I sat there for a long time, letting the weight of what I'd just done settle over me. There was no going back now. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal meetings, paperwork, and uncomfortable silences at home. Megan stayed in the house while we worked out the details of the separation, but we barely spoke. The tension was unbearable, and every interaction felt like a battle. To make matters worse for her, news of the affair began to spread at her workplace. I hadn't said a word to anyone, but someone must have found out, maybe Nick's wife, or perhaps a colleague who had seen too much. Regardless of how it happened, the fallout was swift. One evening, Megan came home looking defeated. She dropped her bag on the floor and slumped onto the couch, her face pale and drawn. They fired me, she said flatly. I didn't respond at first. Part of me felt bad for her, but another part, the part that remembered everything she'd done, felt vindicated. They said my personal conduct was damaging to the company's reputation, she continued, her voice shaking. I don't even know how they found out. I didn't have the heart to tell her that this was just the beginning of the consequences she'd brought on herself. Losing her job was only the first domino to fall. The finalization of the divorce was both a relief and a heartbreak. Standing in court, hearing the judge rule in my favor, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The house was mine, my finances were secure, and I could finally see a path forward. But there was no denying the pain of it all. This wasn't how I had imagined my life turning out. Megan left the house a week later, taking only her clothes and a few personal items. Watching her pack was surreal. She looked like a ghost of the woman I had married, tired, broken, and defeated. As she stood at the door with her suitcase, she turned to me one last time. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just watched as she walked out of the house and out of my life. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but I found solace in the silence. I threw myself into work, into hobbies I'd neglected for years, and into reconnecting with friends and family. Slowly, the pieces of my life started to come back together. As for Megan, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was struggling to find her footing. Without her job, her reputation, or the support she had taken for granted, she was forced to face the consequences of her choices. Part of me felt sorry for her, but another part knew that this was justice. In the end, the divorce wasn't just the end of our marriage, it was the beginning of a new chapter for me. One where I could finally move forward without the shadow of her betrayal hanging over me. The first few weeks after the divorce were some of the hardest of my life. I'd won the legal battle, kept the house, and safeguarded my financial future, but the victory felt hollow. I was left with an empty home, echoes of a broken marriage, and a heart weighed down by betrayal. I spent the first few days stumbling through the motions, working, eating, sleeping, while the silence in the house seemed louder than any argument Megan and I had ever had. But something inside me refused to let this be the end. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life angry and bitter. If Megan's betrayal had taught me anything, it was that I had neglected myself for too long. I had poured so much energy into our marriage, into trying to make things work, that I'd forgotten to take care of my own needs. That had to change. It started with therapy. I'd never been to therapy before, and to be honest, I wasn't sure what to expect. But after everything I'd been through, I knew I needed help to process it all. My therapist, Dr. Patel, was calm, insightful, and most importantly, honest. In our first session, she told me something that stuck with me. You've been through a profound betrayal, she said. But this isn't just about what Megan did. It's about what you do now. You can let this define you, or you can use it to grow. I chose growth. Over the next few months, I began to unpack everything. The anger, the grief, the self-doubt. There were days when it felt unbearable, when I wanted to retreat into old habits of denial and distraction. But Dr. Patel helped me face the pain head-on. I started to understand not only what Megan had done but also the ways I had ignored red flags and neglected my own boundaries. Therapy wasn't just about the past, it was about building a future. I learned to communicate better, to prioritize my own happiness, and to set boundaries that I wouldn't compromise again. Beyond therapy, I threw myself into self-improvement. I joined a gym, not just to get in shape but to channel my frustration into something productive. At first, it was a struggle to drag myself there after work, but as the weeks went by, it became a routine. The physical changes came slowly. A stronger body, more energy, but the mental changes were immediate. Every time I finished a workout, I felt a little lighter, a little more in control. I also rediscovered old hobbies. Photography had always been a passion of mine, but I'd set it aside during the chaos of my marriage. Now, I dusted off my camera and started taking long drives on the weekends, capturing landscapes, cityscapes, and candid moments of strangers. The world felt bigger and more vibrant than it had in years, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly living. Meanwhile, Megan's life took a very different turn. I heard through mutual friends that she was struggling. Losing her job had been a devastating blow, and without the stability of our marriage, she was forced to confront the reality of raising a child on her own. Nick, the man she had risked everything for, had apparently distanced himself once the affair became public knowledge. Whether it was guilt, shame, or fear of losing his own family, he wasn't there for her when she needed him most. Megan was left to navigate the challenges of single parenthood without the support she had likely assumed would be there. I tried not to dwell on her struggles too much. It wasn't my responsibility anymore, and after everything she had done, I didn't owe her anything. But there were moments, late at night, when the house was too quiet, when I couldn't help but wonder if she regretted it all. If she realized what she had thrown away. As the months turned into a year, my life began to feel like my own again. I started spending more time with friends, many of whom I'd lost touch with during my marriage. They welcomed me back with open arms, and those connections became a lifeline. We went out for drinks, played basketball on weekends, and even took a few road trips that reminded me of what it meant to laugh and let go. Dating, however, was a different story. The idea of trusting someone again felt impossible at first. But therapy had taught me not to rush into anything and to focus on myself first. When I finally did start going on dates, I took it slow, making sure I was ready to open up again. There were a few missteps along the way, awkward conversations, mismatched expectations, but eventually, I met someone who made me feel alive again. Her name was Claire, and she was nothing like Megan. She was honest, kind, and had a way of making even the most mundane moments feel special. We started as friends, spending time together without any pressure or expectations. Over time, those feelings deepened, and for the first time in years, I felt a spark of hope for the future. Megan and I had no reason to stay in touch, but every now and then, I'd hear about her through friends or mutual acquaintances. She was still living in the same apartment she'd moved into after the divorce, working a less prestigious job that barely covered her expenses. Raising a child on her own wasn't easy, and the strain showed. I didn't feel joy or satisfaction at her struggles, just a quiet sense of finality. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after the divorce, I ran into Megan by chance. I was walking through the park, camera in hand, when I spotted her sitting on a bench with a stroller. She looked tired, older than I remembered, but there was a softness in her expression as she rocked the stroller back and forth. She saw me and smiled faintly, a look of surprise flickering across her face. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she spoke. "Hi, Alex." "Hi, Megan," I replied, my voice calm but distant. We exchanged a few polite words, nothing more. There was no anger left, no bitterness. Just the quiet understanding of two people who had once shared a life but now walked separate paths. As I walked away, I felt lighter, as if I had finally closed the chapter for good. Life after the divorce wasn't what I had planned, but it was mine. I had rebuilt myself, found happiness again, and learned to value my own worth. Megan's betrayal had broken me, but it hadn't destroyed me. In the end, I came out stronger, ready to face whatever the future held. Goodbye.